Good morning, church. I hope you've had a good week. As we kick off another devotional series, once again, I'm really excited to look at some amazing verses in the Bible. We're going to be looking over the next 8 weeks at some of the most revealing and most intimate conversations that took place between Jesus and his disciples. And they take place over 4 and a bit chapters in the Gospel of John, and they take place in one room. A room with a view. And to begin our series, we are looking at a view of service. I'm hoping that you've perhaps had a chance to look at the verses we plan to discuss, but fear not if you haven't, because we're going to read them now. So grab a Bible or just follow along on screen. I'm going to be reading from the NIV. But as we begin to read though, I just want you to bear in mind something that may just change the way you look at this. For me, it just highlighted the importance of the things that take place and the words that Jesus said and the lessons that we're going to learn over the next 8 weeks. And it's just this fact, that as we read and begin to read at verse 1, in just 24 hours' time, Jesus will have been betrayed, arrested, tortured, sentenced, and crucified upon a cross. So let's read together. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this earth and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "A person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example, that you should do as I have done to you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." It's a wonderful passage, and it paints such a vivid story, and many famous artists have tried to recreate what took place in that upper room. There are many famous paintings, many of them factually incorrect, but we'll get to that. With 17 verses to look at, we need to dive right in, and we need to pick out a few lessons here and there, and verse 1 alone, it tells us so much. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Jesus knew that he would soon leave his disciples. He knew that the very reason he had left heaven in the first place was about to come to fulfillment. The time had now come. At the wedding that he attended with his mother, he uttered these words while he was there. "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." In John chapter 7, when his disciples were warning him of threats being made against him, Jesus said this, Therefore Jesus told them, my time is not yet come. Just a chapter later in John 8, while coming under scrutiny from the Pharisees over his teachings and his testimony, John wrote this. He spoke these words while teaching in the temple courts near the place where the offerings were put. Yet no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. Now in this upper room, Jesus is fully aware that his time had indeed come. I think one of the things that thrills me is when we see just how truly human Jesus was. When we see him react to situations as we would. When we see him show the same emotions that we do. When we see him show the same human frailties that we experience. Jesus was God's son. He could perform miracles. Yes, the man could walk on water, but we can read how he became tired from walking. Yes, the man could turn water into wine, but he knew what it was to be thirsty. Yes, the man could heal the sick and raise the dead, but he knew what it was to shed a tear. And knowing that his time was coming to an end, knowing that what would play out over the next few hours, Jesus did something for me. Well, it's just what I would want to do. He wants to spend time alone with those he loves the most. He wants to spend it with his disciples, with his closest friends. They were his mates. He spent the last 3 years in their company, and he had some final and very important things that he wanted to share with them. And he loved them. Verse 1 closes with the words, he now showed them the full extent of his love. Jesus knew how much his departure would affect them. He knew just how torn apart they would be by the loss of his presence. And so they enjoy a meal together. The disciples at this point are blissfully unaware that they would not share food with Jesus again. A scene that is commonly referred to as the Last Supper. If you type into Google the Last Supper, this is the image that you will get. One of the most famous paintings ever painted. The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. Measuring 5 meters by 9 meters, the painting is on the wall of a former convent in Italy, in Milan. And it's probably one of the most easily recognised paintings known to mankind. It's been copied by artists throughout history. It's thought to represent one of the most important pieces of art ever created. I'd hate to be the one to break it to Mr. Da Vinci, or Leo, as I'm sure his friends used to call him, but you got it completely wrong, mate. The disciples, they weren't sat down like that. This meal didn't take place at a table like we would perhaps imagine. I guess that very painting there has been the source of imagery for millions of people as we try and picture Jesus around the table with his disciples. The Passover meal would be prepared and served at a very different kind of table. A quite low table, a table known as a triclinium, where those dining would be positioned along 3 sides in a reclining position with their legs out behind them and their arms resting upon the table. In all 3 of the other Gospels, the authors speak of Jesus and his disciples reclining at the table. A far better representation of the scene would be this illustration. The artist of this I don't know, but he's created an image that is much closer to the reality of the upper room scene. These positions of the disciples there, it also makes what happens next so much more understandable and easier for us to picture. Midway through the meal, Jesus gets up from the table and he takes off his outer robe and ties a towel around his waist. We don't know if the disciples were immediately aware of Jesus getting up from the table, whether they observed him as he took the towel. Did they begin to wonder and whisper to themselves as he poured water into a basin? What's he doing? But Jesus begins to wash the feet of his disciples, the feet of his friends, the feet of his closest followers. Jesus is washing the feet of those who call him teacher and Lord. Now for us today in 2020, this would be something very strange. I doubt any of us have ever been to a meal or been enjoying a meal with friends when one of the people present had suddenly got up from the table, grabbed a bucket of water and began washing our feet. Feet washing in these days was quite commonplace. The roads of Palestine were dusty and filthy, and it was quite normal that arriving at the home of someone, that your feet would be washed. Sandals were the footwear of the day, and these combined with the dust from the streets and the paths would mean that people would often have very dirty feet. What is the big surprise here, and the thing that would have literally blown the minds of the disciples, was the fact that it was Jesus who was carrying out the washing. The responsibility of washing the feet of your guests was a job that was reserved for the lowliest of servants. It was considered perhaps amongst the most menial tasks that you could be asked to do. The disciples would have been stunned. What's he doing? Why is he doing this? He's our Lord and Master. He shouldn't be washing our feet. This was such an extreme act of servanthood on Jesus' part. He took the position of a slave, one whose role it was to serve others. According to Jewish law and traditions, in the relationship between a teacher and his disciples, a teacher had no right to demand or expect that his disciples wash his feet. It was therefore unthinkable that the master would wash the feet of his disciples. In Luke's Gospel, when he talks about the events in the upper room, we read that the disciples, as they are arriving, to gather around the table, they are arguing with each other. And they are debating who out of the disciples is the greatest amongst them. What Jesus did illustrated true greatness. Jesus was a great storyteller. His parables have been changing the lives of millions for centuries. The lessons he shared through those parables continue to speak to us today. But Jesus also loved an object lesson. And this has to be one of his best. But it wasn't his greatness that he wanted to illustrate. Firstly, there was his humility. The humility that he showed and the grace as he made his way round the table and washed the feet of every disciple, even the feet of Judas, knowing that later that evening Judas would identify him to his captors with a kiss. What must have been running through Judas's mind as this man who he was planning to betray sat and bathed his feet? They say that actions speak louder than words, so he didn't just say it, he showed it. He showed them the lesson and the principle that they had to learn. In 24 hours he would be gone. And over the course of this evening he had so many important things that he wanted to share. And so he took the position of a servant, one whose role it was to serve others. Jesus just days earlier had talked about himself and used these words in Matthew chapter 20. The Son of Man did not come into this world to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many. We've been asking the question in our Meet the Church series recently, who is your favourite Bible character? And I don't think anyone so far has named him, but Peter is one of mine. I've shared this at OSIC before. I love the way he's always at the centre of things when anything's kicking off. And the way he seems to just say the first thing that comes into his head. He doesn't seem to be afraid to speak his mind. Which disciple was the first to climb out the boat, fully clothed, and attempt to walk across the water to Jesus? Which disciple, just after this, in the garden, would start swinging his sword when Jesus is arrested? He is such an impulsive character. So it should come as no surprise that as Jesus makes his way around the table, that it's Peter who pipes up, "You're not washing my feet." Jesus responds with a statement that I doubt Peter was expecting when he says this to him, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Again, Peter with the cracking reply, he says, well, you better wash my hands and my head as well then. Jesus then explained the true meaning of being washed by him. Peter had experienced the cleansing of salvation, and he didn't need to be washed again in a spiritual sense. Because salvation is a one-time act of justification by faith. Part of this object lesson that Jesus was giving was the fact that we need daily cleansing from the dust of sin's pollution that we pick up as we walk the paths of this world. I often use a phrase when I share a message at church, and it's this: if you only take one thing home with you, one verse home with you, take this one. Well, this morning I'm going to slightly rephrase that. Because while you're sat at home watching this, if you take one verse into the rest of your day and week, if you want to screenshot any part of today's devotional, this is the bit to screenshot. And it's verse 14. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. So how do we wash each other's feet? This is not a literal instruction. The act of feet washing was never commanded as a church ritual, and it was never recorded as being part of any church practice anywhere in the New Testament. But we can help clean the dust of sin that each one of us encounters each day by praying for each other, by encouraging each other, by strengthening one another in loving service. As they sat in this upper room, Jesus took off his outer robe and he washed the disciples' feet. The following morning, his robes would be torn from him as he was ridiculed and tortured. Jesus took a basin of water and he washed the disciples' feet. Pilate took a basin of water and washed his hands of the responsibility of passing judgment on an innocent man. The disciples were cleansed. Their feet were cleansed, and in just a few hours' time, the feet of Jesus would be nailed to a cross in a sacrifice that would cleanse the whole of mankind. And so as we start this insight into the upper room, the room with a view, there is so much for us to see. And today we see the view of service that the Lord our Saviour wanted us to follow. Jesus said this in verse 14. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. A room with a view. And this morning our view is a view of service. Have a wonderful day, and God bless.